So good morning, everyone again. So for this morning, it's my privilege to introduce the first speaker of the session, Professor Alexander TROPSHA. Professor TROPSHA is a distinguished professor at the UNC School of Pharmacy at UNC Chapel Hill. Professor TROPSHA obtained his PhD in chemical enzymology in 1986 from Moscow State University, Russia, and came to UNC Chapel Hill in 1999 as a postdoctoral fellow. He joined the School of Pharmacy in 1991 as an assistant professor and became full professor in 2002. His research interests are in the areas of computer-aided drug design, chemoinformatics, computational toxicology, materials informatics, structural bioinformatics, and biomedical knowledge graph mining. He has authored and co-authored more than 282 peer-reviewed research papers and reviews, book chapters, and co-edited 2 monographs. He has trained more than 30 graduate students and over 30 postdoctoral fellows. He has served as member of the editorial board and associate editor of ACS Journal of Chemical Information and Modeling, and his research has been supported by multiple grants from NIH, NSF, EAP, DoD foundations, and private companies. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. I was actually practically prompted to leave by Dr. Warnick. He said that today's lectures are going to be fantastic. I didn't want to spoil the impression. Hassa, you've been in my lab, you've been trained in my lab, you should have learned this and say things much faster. So I'm going to talk about relatively new topic. I have a proof that it's new, related to what I think all of us, especially younger people in the room, are going to be using, exposed to, because we're talking about capturing what drives science, which is capturing knowledge. And just to introduce the subject, arguably, this is the world in which we exist. We depend on others, typically, to collect data, going from bench side to various representations of the data, to extracting knowledge from the data, which is summative, predictive statements we could make based on data analytics. And that leads to wisdom, which is suggesting and practicing new experiments. And the question really is, and I think almost any talk, any presentation that you've had will have, fantastic presentations, are going to talk about some aspects of this big bench to data to knowledge to wisdom. And of course, the trick is how to suggest new experiments. I will be talking about particular ways of exploring this knowledge and introduce some terms. Surprisingly, the formulations of these terms can be attributed to a political leader, which is a rare case. If you read what Donald Rumsfeld said about types of knowledge and types of unawareness, he gave the terms known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns without specifying, which is pretty typical of political speeches, as you may agree with. But arguably, this is what we deal with. Sometimes we want a confirmation of what we already know. I'll give you an example on the next slide. So we call this known knowns. Sometimes, which is a subject of scientific investigation, we deal with known unknowns. There are answers in the world, but we don't know about these answers, but we know how to ask questions. So that's the example of known unknowns. The most interesting, arguably, is unknown unknown. We don't even know that things exist and what questions we need to ask, but sometimes we just need to be careful in analyzing what the world has to offer, asking the right question, getting the right answers. One example is COVID-19, for which we have thought of rational ways of developing vaccines and drugs, but we didn't know to ask the question before COVID-19 emerged. Examples of those closer to home, known knowns, we may remember what drug treats what disease, and we just need to verify our knowledge by extracting direct relationships between drugs and diseases. We need to go to drug bank. Probably no one knows all of this by heart, that we know that things exist. If a drug is sold in the store, we know how to retrieve the known knowledge. Known unknown answers the questions how the drug treats the disease. Modern drug discovery is predicated on the knowledge of specific targets. Typically, those are elucidated. So known unknown is asking the question how the drug treats the disease and then getting an answer by mining the literature, mining special tools. Unknown unknowns, but arguably this is a question as soon as it arises, we know how to answer. And I'll give you examples, specific examples of this. And specific example I will give will be drug baricitinib that was uncovered quickly in response to COVID-19 as a drug to treat the disease with a particular mechanism specified as to how this could happen. So that this I'll give you these examples to make you think about what is knowledge, how we capture knowledge, how we present knowledge, and how we find ways of analyzing the existing knowledge to come up with wise suggestions as to how this knowledge can be additionally enriched. And particular approach that I will describe today, which is really emerging, both in terms of ways of capturing knowledge and ways of analyzing, exploring, exploiting this knowledge, has become known as knowledge graphs. So I'll talk a little bit about the philosophy of this approach. I'll talk about efforts that we need to go through to build knowledge graphs. And I hope you'll find recognizable elements in what I describe and map some of the discussion I'm going to have onto lectures that have been given or will be given. Most importantly, how we mine knowledge, code it in the form of knowledge graphs. And I'll give some examples of applications, and I will even suggest as a school, I'll even suggest an exercise to the end. So those of you who are prohibited to use laptops during lectures of esteemed speakers, pull them out and go and dance with me to the end. So that will be allowed and maybe rewarded additionally by the organizers. So I've mentioned that this is a very, very new topic. How do you know if the topic is new or old? There are multiple ways of mining publications. There is a tool, I don't know how many people are familiar with it. I use it sometimes to look at the history of particular concept evolution. It's Google Books Ngram Viewer that allows one to look at the history of using particular terms or co-using, correlation between terms in the published literature, unfortunately only in the books, not in publications. Knowledge, as we could see, goes back to using this term in publications to before 1800. If I type knowledge graph, it's almost invisible. If we blow it, unfortunately I could not control colors, you could see that this term really appeared in the published literature really in the last decade or so. And more specifically, if we look at, again, the more or less topic of this workshop, stuff that knowledge relevant to biomedical research, the first paper annotated in PubMed was published in 2015. And so this whole concept of biomedical knowledge graph as an item in the literature has emerged very recently, but relatively speaking, has been growing. There are 46, there are, I think, 50-something publications, 40 publications last year, and more than half in 2022 already. So that's a topic that's becoming of the growing interest to the research community. And I'll try to explain why and what kind of hidden jewels of knowledge can be extracted by this approach. So what are we talking about? What do we call knowledge graphs? Traditionally, we think in terms of matrices of data. When we build QSR models, when we build similarity searches, when we do docking exercises, anything that we typically do in biomolecular simulations, we try to represent knowledge in the form of matrices. This is how people report the results of screening, biological screening of drugs. Knowledge graphs represent a way of breaking out of this historical data matrix and describe and developing and integrated what I'd like to call connected knowledge, which can be done at different scales of biological, biomedical, or generally speaking, knowledge organization. This is not unfamiliar. I mentioned that a lot of concepts in biomedical knowledge graph representation, mining, exploration are familiar. When we say graphs, the word graph is very close to the heart of any chemoinformatician because that's pretty much how we derive originally chemical descriptors from a graph representation of chemical structures. The transition from irregular organic chemist representation of molecules to chemical graphs to descriptors is at the core of chemoinformatics. But we could also regard, as in, for example, a chemical structure as a knowledge graph where the known knowns are individual entities such as atoms or functional groups, and the relationship between them is coded in the form of annotated chemical bonds. Right? An annotation can have a directionality if we want to capture the bond polarity. It can also have attributes such as single, double, triple bond, heterobond, etc. So this is a way of representing knowledge of a chemical in the form of knowledge graph. And at the higher level, a knowledge about what drugs do, what receptors they bind to, and how this binding results in a therapeutic action of a drug, that is coded up as an elementary knowledge graph, in this case, a knowledge graph triplet. And in fact, the entire objective of target-based, target-driven drug discovery is elucidating the relationship between drugs, targets, diseases that can be, as I will demonstrate, captured in the form of knowledge graphs and extracted and analyzed as a path through the knowledge graph. I mentioned that this is relatively emergent concept in the literature, but of course, nothing is done at once. The origin is considered to be semantic web, which was popular 40, 50 years ago, and was the idea of linking different websites for quickly finding the information by common terms and by relationships between individual sites that did not particularly work as an effective approach. It worked, but it was replaced by faster ways of mining knowledge in the websites through machine learning algorithms and the advancement of smart APIs. The concept as a graph was really introduced by Google in 2012, so I give a reference here, as a way of recognizing that when we ask a question, in this case about Mona Lisa, we don't just want to know what is it, but we also want to know what it's connected to, where the picture was drawn, where is it located, where it traveled, etc. And so you could quickly build a network of related concepts to the query that you have. And then you could start asking questions that really explore all the knowledge about and associated with a particular subject of interest, such as who painted it, where was it done, where are the most famous, where the painting is located, where it traveled, etc. And so this is an instance of a semantically based knowledge graph associated with a particular object. So that was the beginning. That's how Google really advanced search capabilities and knowledge discovery capabilities. And then this concept of knowledge graph had proliferated. And if you search the literature, you find instances of modern knowledge graph applications in almost any area of human knowledge, from social sciences to biomedical discipline. Important to recognize what makes knowledge graphs so rich and interesting to explore, as opposed to more simple, homogeneous graphs, where edges connecting specific objects don't have typically directionality or any particular attributes. In knowledge graphs, it's important to capture different types of ontological objects. In our cases, drugs, diseases, pathways, etc., and the directionality, whenever possible, whenever it's found in the literature, between these objects. So you could explore paths of specific meaning that connect objects of interest, and I'll give you some examples to this effect. So what it takes to build a knowledge graph. So I'll go through knowledge sources, something that is absolutely critical to build a knowledge graph, which is naming, nomenclature, and ways of relating objects to each other, which is ontology. What it takes to build knowledge graphs, mine, generate and explore hypotheses associated with knowledge graphs. So hopefully I will excite you about this way of looking at the data that I found absolutely exciting in the last few years working on this. What do we want of knowledge graphs? Capture complexities of data and relationships between data, which creates an opportunity to mine existing or new knowledge, going back to known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. So these are examples, some examples of application. In order to enable this type of analysis, data should be suitable for intended task, publicly accessible, high quality, actively maintained. So everything we learn about data curation and the importance of data curation is the beginning. If the primary data is wrong, inaccurate, or doesn't exist or incomplete, we cannot derive knowledge in the form of knowledge graphs, let alone analyze and make hypotheses. We start with knowledge sources. Knowledge sources are databases as we know them, with a caveat that we need to map the objects and relationships between objects captured in these databases onto the common ontology, bring together data from different databases, integrate, identify duplicates, use the same terminology for the same object coming from different databases. That's what we need to do to connect knowledge. So these are the requirements that we need to have to build a knowledge graph. We need to define entities, relations, ability to ingest data, which is currently done through smart APIs. We have to mine data and create meta graphs and meta paths by accessing distributed data in different databases and without having to log in. So it's absolutely critical that common databases that we typically use to find specific knowledge need to be open for exploration, so we could freely grab data from these databases. And of course, data curation is critical. We'll not talk much about this, just mention the importance of it. And then there are various characteristics that entities, relations, ingestion, and curation need to happen. There are various, I'm not going to read this, and I'll share the slides, but that's the requirements of what we call good knowledge sources, right? And knowledge sources is a different name for databases, but in the context of the ability to integrate and explore this knowledge. Ontology is akin chemical and biological data curation in the areas of chemoinformatics, where it's really and some of you know my work, we've spent tremendous amount of time doing and convincing people to do it, and that is data curation. Not only capturing data, but also suspecting, trust but verify, suspecting that the data that we capture may not be accurate, should be curated in order to enable data exploration. The whole objective is captured by this diagram. Obviously, as you know, the same object can be represented or described by different words. If you look for aspirin, 50 commercial names, if not more, right? But we should know that it's the same molecule. So the same is true. It's been incredibly important to develop and use a normalized ontology where major biomedical concepts are first developed and specific objects described in the literature databases are mapped onto this unified ontology so that the same chemical molecule is recognized as a single entity. And that allows us then to map all possible synonymous terms related to a particular molecule in terms related to these molecules and to a single systematized knowledge graph, right? So that's what's critical to define the structure of ontological classes, ascribe each entity to a particular class in a hierarchical class structure. Perhaps the best known ontology is MESH, which is what's behind PubMed, which allows us to mine literature so quickly and extract all the literature associated with a particular search concept. Predominantly, I'm going to be talking about a knowledge graph that was developed at UNC by a group of scientists funded by NIH, and we've called it RoboCop. talk a little bit more about it, but there are emerging sources of knowledge graphs and different emerging commercial and non-commercial commercial knowledge graphs, but I'll be giving examples done with RoboCop. So that's the critical aspect. I'll go quickly through what it means to create a biomedical ontology. So we're talking about first types of ontology. As in any discipline, different groups have thought about different ways of creating a name and nomenclature. So this is a list of different ontologies that have to be captured, harmonized, normalized by really each and everyone. It's kind of self-serving task to integrate data that are mapped onto different ontologies and develop translation between ontologies. But you see some recognizable names such as mesh. Monarch is one of the ontologies that have been developed by a large group at, in the US and one of the federal labs. So this is very quickly types of knowledge that needs to be mapped, integrated, and unified that relates to different types of ontologies, and that's what we need to use to be able to integrate data from different databases. And then more specifically, as you know, genes may have different names in different databases, so you need to map. For biomedical knowledge graphs, you need to map gene and protein data. I'll be quick here. Interactions, right? So we capture objects and interaction between them. Again, it should be the same standardized nomenclature as to what codes for what. We need to make decisions. So in the group I've been involved in, it's been a very long months and months and months of arguments whether proteins and genes are the same ontological entities or not. Frequently, people use names of genes and proteins interchangeably. Frequently, we need to know that a protein is coded by the gene, so it's not the same entry in the databases. So all of this oftentimes is predicated on the use, but these are the types of databases, knowledge sources, and associated ontological efforts that relate to gene and protein interactions. Pathways, there are databases and ontologies of pathways, and databases and ontologies of diseases, including rare diseases. So a lot of effort, and of course, chemical and drug data, right? And as I quickly go through these elements of building a knowledge graph, you recognize individual terms that we use colloquially and in scientific publications all the time, because we're talking about drug discovery, targets for drug discovery, pathways that are affected by the action of drugs, relationship between pathway and diseases, all in order to uncover or predict new drugs for existing or newly described diseases. So RoboCop is a project we started about 5 years ago. It stands for Reasoning Over Biomedical Objects Linked in Knowledge-Oriented Pathways, somewhat long-term, but of course, and oftentimes I first find a word that I like, and then I fit the words to this word. So that's how this started. It was an effort by one of my colleagues to go away with it because at some point using the word cop inside an abbreviation was not considered plausible, but I insisted to keep this. So we call it RoboCop. So as pictured in this diagram, RoboCop knowledge graph integrates individual concepts and instances representing those concepts in relation to biomedical science. But you could imagine terms related to social science, material science, so the next talk is going to be about materials informatics. There are emerging efforts to build knowledge graphs for pretty much every major discipline and explore those graphs to uncover existing or new knowledge. The history behind RoboCop is a concept initially formulated by one of the units within NIH called NCATS. Chris Austin, former director of NCATS, who moved away from NIH a couple of years ago, had this really brilliant ideas. He sort of compared the task of capturing biomedical knowledge and integrating this knowledge in the form of knowledge graphs, similar to Mendeleev's effort to integrate chemical knowledge and create a periodic table of elements. So this is sort of periodic table of human biomedical knowledge. Ultimate idea is to integrate public data and patient data somehow, about HIPAA and other constraints, but integrate public biomedical research data and patient data into connected knowledge and explore this knowledge to the benefits of patients and humanity. So that's the overarching concept. A specific example of how this concept is integrated in RoboCop. The objective is this is what we do as scientists, we ask questions. What is a new drug to treat a particular disease? What is the best way of modifying a chemical to obtain a more active chemical? What is the best way of retrosynthesizing a chemical of interest, etc.? We ask questions, and we could answer these questions by going into integrated knowledge. So I introduced already knowledge sources. In RoboCop, we have currently about 20 plus individual databases that we integrated as knowledge sources with open APIs, and it's about 21 plus million individual objects, and last time we counted was about 140 million connections, and that is captured from biomedical literature and databases in the form of individual entries mapped on a particular ontology and linked according to the annotations about object linking in these databases. So you start to answer questions such as, what are the novel Fanconi anemia genes? What are the novel therapeutic candidates to treat this disease? By going to individual knowledge sources, identifying specific types of data in these objects. And as you could see, genes or proteins can be found in different databases. That's where harmonization becomes important. So that leads to this integrated knowledge graph with different levels of knowledge represented as connected nodes. And that, once the graph is built, we could reason over this knowledge graph. And reasoning over knowledge graph is answering the question how things are connected. So if we ask a question which is rather simple, what are the novel genes? We need to go to the knowledge graph. We need to identify a node called Fanconi anemia under the ontological class of diseases and look at the captured linkages between this type of object and a concept called drugs, which are individual nodes on the graph. We could look for direct connections, so that would be known unknowns, or we could look for inferred connections. And that will tell us if there is a plausible hypothesis, mechanistically explained, that connects a drug and particular disease. So that's sort of the example of how the knowledge is integrated and how overall we proceed with analyzing this knowledge. The simplest example of knowledge graph, this is actually sort of precedes our work of knowledge graphs. We developed a decade ago a protocol that we've called Chemotext that in retrospect was an attempt to mine knowledge in the form of connected graphs. So Don Swanson, who was a faculty at School of Library Science at the University of Chicago, came up with a concept of exploring published papers for co-occurrences of specific terms and then making inferences on the basis of this. And that really is what's behind Swanson's is a semantic triplet, subject, object, predicate. So that's the elementary unit now of any knowledge graph. Swanson came up with an idea of analyzing co-occurrence of certain terms in the biomedical literature and interpreting frequent co-occurrence of, for instance, a term magnesium and a term vasodilation as a functional relationship between a drug or a chemical, in this case magnesium, and a physiological process known as vasodilation. And at the same time, he also published a disconnected layer of literature where vasodilation was related to migraine. He found no literature where someone would talk about magnesium as a cure for migraine. And so he published a paper in 1990 introducing this sort of reasoning triangle, inductive reasoning triangle, ABC, where you could define particular types of terms, A class, B class, C class, identify relationships between A and B at the very simple level of term co-occurrence, interpret this as a functional relationship, and then deduce a new relationship. And that type of inductive reasoning is really behind many of the applications of knowledge graph mining in the modern science. When we, as I mentioned, we have millions, dozens of millions of objects and hundreds of millions of connections between them. So that's sort of the origin of reasoning. What's happening now is, so now that I've introduced what is a knowledge graph and how to build a knowledge graph, I'll talk briefly about ways of exploring it and give you a few examples of how this can be done. So the simplest, the most direct. And I just gave you an example of this. The simplest, most direct way of exploring a knowledge graph is so-called rule mining. In this particular case, we introduce, well, actually, I think it's, let me check. It's the next slide. The idea here is identify a type of relationship that we're interested in, and then look for instances of small subgraphs of particular semantic meaning that connects to term of interest, right? We call this rule. If term A and term X, or term X and term Y are connected directly, what other subgraphs of particular architecture that frequently connect the same terms? So that those can be interpreted then as a graph-based rules. You could then mine existing knowledge for instances of the rules and postulate new connections between termini of the first and the last node of the graph. So that's what, and there is a particular approach in software association rule mining and the incomplete evidence. That's basically figuring out what kind of path exists, frequent path exists that connect terms of interest. So more specifically, if we are interested in finding rules behind drug treats disease relationships, right? And those are extracted from common knowledge sources such as Drug Bank or Drug Central. What is behind this? So we can identify all instances of these types of semantic triples, drug treats disease, and then ask if there are some common rules behind this direct connection, such as drug interacts with a gene or a protein, and that gene or protein is linked to the disease, overexpressed, for instance, in case of disease. So drug, gene, disease becomes a rule behind direct connection between drug and disease, right? And that type of rule mining then allows you, sometimes rules could be more elaborate. Sometimes you could have branched rules or conditional rules. So that's what makes it more interesting and time consuming. But in the end, once you mine rules and find that frequently there are certain rules behind drug treats disease, edges of interest, and our interest, scientific interest is to forecast and then test new drug disease relationships, which is behind drug repurposing. You could then mine the entire huge graph for instances of rules where the drug and disease nodes are not connected in the graph, right? So that's known, right? We know what kind of questions to ask, and so that allows us to postulate new drug disease connections. I'll show you examples of hypotheses for drug repurposing. To be more specific about the types of rules and more pragmatic, a few months ago, published a paper where we defined the concept of clinical outcomes pathways for a series of drug action that relates historically and philosophically to adverse outcome pathways that have been used in toxicology for years. And so here is an example of building this pathway that manually, initial, that can be elucidated now with one of the standard queries in Robocop. Let's say it became known that a cancer drug imatinib can treat asthma. Question is how? So you create first an ontological pathway. We know that typically a drug should hit a target. Target operates within a pathway. Pathway operates within a cell type with tissue. And then some processes occurring in cell type of issues or phenotypes associated with it are regarded as a symptom of the disease. So that link, drug to target to pathway to cell type to symptom to disease, is a general clinical outcome pathway, and we could solve for specific topics or specific elements or nodes in this pathway, and that would be a solution to a hypothesis that imatinib treat asthma through some reasonable series of biochemical events. So in this paper, it went online in February and became a full publication this month, I think. We give several examples of defining clinical outcome pathways, starting with a drug, capturing what's known as molecular initiating event. Typically, it's drug-target interaction, and then various intermediary events that leads to a clinical outcome. For several drugs, we also presented a case of rapid discovery of a potential pathway behind real-world clinical observation, something that was popular a year and a half ago, that Pepsid seems to be protective against COVID-19. There were clinical publications reporting that relatively large number of patients who've historically been using Pepsid with active drug famotidine as part of the active ingredient being famotidine seem to be protective against COVID more than others who didn't have it. It was a multi-author publication looking at possible mechanisms. So that's the amount of people it took to publish. And then the same question can be quickly, so that's uncovering, call it known, unknown, or unknown, but you could quickly mine a knowledge graph and ask a question: what is a plausible mechanistic relationship between famotidine and the disease that was initially designed to treat, and COVID-19 through a particular series of biochemical events and physiological events associated with the lung functioning. So that's just an example of quickly using knowledge graphs to test hypotheses that emerge from the literature or from the researcher's mind, and kind of looking at mechanistic pathways that are associated drug and disease. There are much more complex examples. People in environmental science and environmental diseases publish a lot of literature, so it's very difficult to go through this, but that's an example of captured knowledge about asthma, environmental determinants of asthma, genes associated with the disease, as well as, in this case, particulate matter 2.5, which is largely considered a cause, or at least the cause of asthma attacks. And that's the capture. Just I wanted to show one scary example of an answer graph that talks about how entities related to asthma and its treatment, so disease, perturbant that causes or exacerbates the disease, genes associated with it, and drugs that have been developed to treat the disease, and mechanisms of those drugs. So that's sort of the one example of how connected knowledge about one disease can be represented in mind, more specifically, the case of knowledge graphs. Quickly, about emerging approaches to graph exploration. So we need to formulate the concept, find ways of building knowledge graphs, find ways of defining knowledge graphs, mining, etc. Much time do I have? 5, 2, 3, 1. Okay. I'll go through some of the slides. So there are different ways of exploring knowledge graphs. Let me give you this case of baricitinib. Quick action by Benevolent AI. They've built a knowledge graph apparently before COVID. This is the whole history. In February, they published a paper saying baricitinib could be a treatment for COVID-19. Then clinical investigations followed. As of this year, it's approved by FDA to treat some COVID patients with heavy case of COVID. So this is knowledge graph-based discovery. Specifically, what they've done was to say what's known at that time, that ACE2 is a human enzyme that mediates or is involved in etiology of COVID. They've looked at the knowledge graph to figure out that what's known to be associated with COVID. There are biochemical mechanisms behind ACE2, and by reasoning through this knowledge graph, came up to baricitinib as a drug of potential choice. That's one of those cases of successful discovery using knowledge graphs. What else can I show quickly? Just examples. Let me do this. Types of questions that could be asked: what drugs may treat chronic pain? You ask the question, you go into knowledge graph, you mine it. Real life observation: insulin is common among patients with a particular condition that destroys lungs. What is the mechanism behind it? You identify a common target that links this disease and diabetes, and that gives you a plausible explanation as to why treatment of insulin, clinical observation, real world, can exist. Other cases like this. Let me skip this. This is a story you could then read, multiple applications. So what I don't have time to show is you could build specialized knowledge graph. We've been doing this a lot. Specialized knowledge graph about COVID, so we called it COVID COP. Special knowledge graph, we investigated toxicity of metals, so we call it metal COP. There are multiple COPs that can be created. Specific example, and that's something that you could do on your own by going to this website, robocop.fancy.org. If you start from a clinical observation, there is a drug called bupropion prescribed off-label to treat ADHD. Can we rationally explain how this can be done? And so this is a little movie showing how to ask this question. So you type first the name of the question, so this ADHD drug repurposing. You create the first node, and you search through the database of diseases, quickly identifying ADHD as one of those diseases. That's the first node. Then you go to the next node. There is a drug that we want to know about, whether it treats this disease. So you basically, what you do here is you create a query. You find a drug, known drug that treats ADHD. So now you could integrate a query when you have a disease, a known drug that treats this disease, and a drug you think may treat this disease. So that's a query, right? So if you want to mine a knowledge graph, you want to create a query which has wildcards and then look for answers in the knowledge graph. And that search typically takes less than a minute. Again, everything that you see on the screen can be repeated at home with no harm. So now we have a query created. So we're basically looking for a common connection between ADHD, existing drug, and a drug we think may treat HDD through a particular mechanism. So, and that's the answers that you get. So toward the end, this is a global effort. There are a lot of people in academia and a lot of industry that are trying to build and explore different knowledge graphs. And basically, you could read the summary. This is what we want. This is a way, again, that's why I'm saying that all of us, one way or another, I think are going to be relying on connected knowledge and its exploration in the form of knowledge graphs. So thank you for listening. And of course, I want to thank my collaborators and funding sources. That's Amanda. Thank you.
So we have time for one good question.
Oh, Alex, if A implies B and B implies C, then A implies C. I'm not sure about the Neanderthal, but Cro-Magnon men surely knew this. My question is, what exactly did our superhero Don Swanson discover?
I think you are misusing the terms, maybe intentionally, knowing you. I did not say A implies B. I said A and B are connected by known, and B and C are connected by known, but nobody knows if A and C are connected. In order to ask the question, you first capture instances of known and think of the connecting term. The discovery that Swanson made, and I really encourage you to read his papers, was that scientists typically work in silos. Publish in silos, don't cross-reference each other. So he was a librarian. And what he found is that people who study mechanistic effects of drugs don't look at, or chemicals, don't look at what these mechanistic effects mean for physicians. People who are physicians don't really look. I work with them. For them, best case scenario, they know the name of the drug. They never think that the drug has a chemical structure. So that's really what he did, is that he had thought about ways of connecting disconnected literature sources and creating a meaningful hypothesis out of this connection.
He's jumping at this.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So I was wondering, are your graphs bidirectional, so the edges? So you draw a lot of them by directed edges?
It depends, right? So it depends. You could say drug induces the expression of gene, or you could say expression of gene depends on the drug.
Okay,
In some cases, when we don't know the directionality, just say the word connected, when you don't know the details. So it could be directional or non-directional.
Okay, I was just wondering why the questions are not more open if you have the full graph, like saying what helps against COVID-19. So most of your questions were very precise already between all the elements which are involved.
I gave precise examples to explain what this is. The open type questions are the best, indeed. Absolutely. Yes.